Alrighty friends, welcome back to History with Tim. Today we're diving into another fascinating chapter of a military history. At the time you're watching this, I'll actually be exploring the beautiful landscapes of Ireland, where history is as rich as it gets. But I couldn't leave without sharing this exciting video with you. We're exploring the evolution of American Army uniforms, from the blue coats of the Revolutionary War to the advanced gear of today's soldiers. Why did these uniforms change so much, and what do they tell us about the wars, technologies, and times they represent? And before we begin, a huge thank to Griffin Johnsen and his amazing team at the Armchair Historian for making this video possible. Their dedication to bringing history to life has been invaluable. So, let's march through the past and uncover the stories stitched into the fabric of the American Army uniform. Now, this is going to be from Armchair Historian. I'm starting to get a little more into these reactions. I really don't like doing them. I like doing original content, but because I am going to be in Ireland and I don't have a lot of time because obviously I had to work a lot more because I was heading to a foreign country. I'm going to be doing a lot of reactions these next few weeks. I don't want to do them. I just think they're easier just for the time being. I want to make sure I get content out to you guys. Please bear with me. But with this, I've always loved Griffin. Griffin's actually one of the reasons I really got into this. And, you know, he was the kind of guy I would watch late at night when I was just bored in bed or something, or even on my way home from work or school. And he does a few of these. So I'm going to do the evolution of the American Army uniform first, just because of we've been covering the American Civil War so much, and we've discussed other periods in American history. We did a long series about the Napoleonic War. That also crosses over with our War of 1812. And this will bring us all the way up to the modern day. It's going to start with Continental Militia, and it's going to end with the forces of today. As usual, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy the channel, please subscribe, hit that red bell button to stay notified when we have new videos out. Also, we do have a Patreon. Please try to join our Patreon. We do have 5 ranks. We have Private, we have Sergeant, we have Captain, we have Colonel, and if you wish to join my staff and help me make some original content, we have Marshal to join my little Imperial staff. And with that said, let's get into it.
Prior to the formation of a professional army, the 13 colonies were defended by militiamen, or Minutemen. These Minutemen fought in the opening battles of the American War of Independence, such as the battles of Lexington and Concord. In contrast,
So, not to get into the politics of the day, but Continental Militiamen, and what I'm going to do is as we go through each uniform, I'm going to stop and discuss it. So the Continental Militiamen, that's just citizen soldiers. That's what the Second Amendment was created for. The idea that regular citizens can come together and form militias to defend their homes and towns and so on. Obviously, one of the most important things was Lexington and Concord. But to be honest, the militia actually played a crucial role in the American Revolution all the way up until the end of the war. You know, the movies like Patriot kind of, they show a very dramatized version, but that is something militia were used for. They were used as guerrilla fighters, and they were used to march with the main army. The army that George Washington took command of in Boston after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, when the Continental Congress met, that army was mainly Massachusetts and New England militias who had all come to besiege Boston. So this is actually what you would have seen in those early days. Most of the army would have looked like this. Obviously, it would be different clothes and stuff, but it was a civilian force.
to the British regulars they fought, they wore a patchwork of civilian clothing. The first American regulars were equipped with muskets, much like the rest of the world. During the first years of their existence, the American military was not formally organized until Prussian officer Friedrich von Steuben disciplined them into a true fighting force at Valley Forge.
So this is what we see. This is what our uniforms would come to look like at the end of the war. Now, if you notice something he mentioned Baron von Steuben. Steuben was a Prussian military officer. Steuben he brought etiquette, he brought everything to our army while at Valley Forge. If you do notice, our uniforms look very similar to Prussian military uniforms. For one, blue dye was cheap. It was a cheap dye, so they were able to mass produce them. And also, to be perfectly honest, the majority of the army actually didn't wear uniforms. If you were able to afford it, you were able to get one tailored. But this is what the army, because again, something you need to remember about our army at this time, it was strictly volunteer. There was no standing army. And if there were standing troops, it was maybe the size of a brigade. It wasn't like a gigantic army, maybe a little over 1,000 men as a standing army. Of course, at the end of the war, you had thousands of soldiers, but when we went to peacetime, we kept in these uniforms, the tricorns, and we stuck with that until 1812, pretty much, because that's the era of the shakos and stuff, which should be next.
Where Americans began habitually wearing uniforms. These newly professionalized soldiers marched to victories at Saratoga, Kings Mountain, and ultimately Yorktown. Although
another thing to note is this wasn't the only uniform. Certain units would have different uniforms. Dan Boone, it was Dan Boone, right? I think it was Dan Boone. Dan Boone, famously, they wore pelts as their uniform, him and his marksmen. Some units wore green uniforms. Blue was not the only color. You had other light infantry units that wore white uniforms. It was just, the blue was supposed to be the standardized uniform. Blue is what our generals wore. Washington wore a blue tunic. What differentiated the officers from the infantrymen originally, Washington actually wanted to do it by a sash system, which kind of did continue into the coming years. Washington would wear a sky blue sash, which kind of worked into propaganda for his enemies, because the sash Washington would wear was seen as the royal sash, but it would turn over in a few years. Obviously, Washington never became a king or anything, but the sash system did survive up until probably the end of the Civil War, because that's when it kind of starts getting phased out. What you would usually have was golden sash was a general, a red sash was colonel to captain, and then lieutenants wouldn't wear sashes usually. Usually lieutenant down, and then scarlet red would be sergeants, color sergeants mainly. But that's usually how the system would work. Lieutenants didn't wear sashes. It was just so you could tell who was who on the field, is why we started that. But blue became the color of our army at that time. And it actually made a comeback as our dress uniforms for a while, until the Trump administration, where he brought back the olive drab, which I actually, the pinks and greens as they call them, which I think most people actually like better. Those are the uniforms we wore during World War II. I digress. We're getting there quickly.
Continental militiamen were used extensively for the entirety of the war. Unlike their musketeer counterparts, Morgan,
that's who it was, not Dan Boone. Dan Boone's another frontier character. We have so many frontier characters here. But Morgan's riflemen,
who functioned as a light infantry force, carried a true rifle, the grooved barrels of which allowed the musket ball to spin for far greater accuracy.
And if you ever see... Oh, wow. That was a weird timing. And if you ever see the movie The Crossing, fantastic movie, you actually see Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. So that's a really cool movie. I would suggest you see it. It's so good. Jeff Daniels plays George Washington. There's only one inaccuracy, and that's the use of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton actually only got noticed by Washington at the Battle of Trenton. He would not become his primary staff officer until after Trenton. So that's the really only big inaccuracy. The rest is very true. Gates and Washington hated each other, which they show in the movie. Highly recommend it. It was a made-for-TV movie. I gotta say, these channels need to start making these historical made-for-TV movies again, because it's a really good movie. but you actually see Morgan's riflemen in it.
Uniforms of this period maintained a predominantly blue color palette, although some details of the uniform evinced a Prussian influence, particularly the cuffs and collar. Officers continued to have edged weapons at their side.
So again, you're going to see this a lot in American history. And, you know, one of the first series I actually did on this channel, way back when I was still a history guy, was on the Franco-Prussian War. We took a lot of influence from the Prussians. They were the military, they were a small kingdom, but they were declared the best soldiers in the world. The famous quote is, for most nations, for most states, they have an army. For Prussia, their army has a state. They were very strict with their military operations, and Prussia actually is where you'll start seeing meritocracy used more than nobility or commissions based on stance in society. It's under Frederick the Great that he actually says, no, we need an actual army. It can't be, oh, you're a duke over here, cool. Just because you're a duke doesn't mean you know how to fight a war. So he would institute one of the first military academies in Europe to train everyone, regardless if you're a peasant, regardless if you're a lord, you're all trained together. It's based on merit, and that's where you'll see some of these great generals rise from. But as for the United States, we gained a lot of our, you know, a lot of people think that the blue color pattern was actually from the French. The French, until the end of the Revolution, were still wearing the white uniforms, or maybe even the powder blue uniforms. It won't be until the Revolution that they start wearing the blue uniforms. And again, it's kind of for the same reason we did, and the same reason the Prussians did. And, you know, as you probably noticed, I wear blue a lot as well. That's for a different reason, because it's slimming. But the Prussians, the French, and us realized it's the cheapest color to make. Blue is a cheap color. So it's very easy to get indigo dye and make blue uniforms. You know, the red uniforms of the British Army were very expensive to make. Or even, you know, some forces in Russia, the green uniforms. Like, green's a cheap color too, but blue was much more able to be made quicker and more productively. And that's why you're going to see we wore blue up until pre-World War One. Blue, we only stopped wearing blue because our generals were like, this is kind of stupid. We're able to see you on a battlefield very easily. We should start doing more earth tones. And that's where you'll start seeing that slow turn into the earth tones. But blue did remain our dress uniform for quite some time. It would also end in World War One, but we would bring it back in the post-World War era. And then, obviously, like I said before, the Trump administration would bring back the pinks and green, which, again, is a very handsome-looking uniform, too. But let's continue.
A popular piece for ranked individuals of most armies around the world.
I also, if you look at the hilt, that's a cool thing. That's a European inspiration, too. So I actually have an American Civil War command sword here. And if you look at, you could tell the pommels are different, because the command sword, which they'll probably show later on, is just a standard pommel. It's just, you know, it's a little bit of a circle with the screw that holds it together at the bottom, and then it goes in. If you notice, this is very European in style. It's got that eagle pommel on it. What's the emblem of the United States? The bald eagle. So this is very cool, and this is back when uniforms, it was about pageantry. You know, one of the best lines in the movie Waterloo is when Wellington is watching the French walk out, and he says, "Dramatic fellows, these French bands and standards and banners," and he's like, "It's quite beautiful." This is that era. This is that era. And honestly, that's why in the American Civil War you see so many colorful units in the early war, because as I've said in many of my videos, that is the end of that era. The linear style of fighting, or better known as the Napoleonic era, dies with the Civil War, and the modern era of warfare begins.
The pommels of American sabers were styled after eagles' heads.
I swear to God, this is my first time watching this fully through.
Further cementing the bald eagle as a symbol of American identity. American forces were able to stand their ground and hold the line during the siege of Fort Texas. Although the blue color was still prominent, there was a noticeable change in headwear. Soldiers began to wear a type of visor cap, in contrast to the taller and somewhat less fashionable shako-style hats. Union troops
all right, let's hop back real quick to that one. I didn't know how long that one would go. So if we look at this uniform, we're going to notice it's lighter blue. Now, a lot of the reasons, and you're going to notice this also with the rifles they're using. So what they're using right there is an 1846 Springfield. I actually also have that gun. Because when I reenacted as the Irish Brigade, and the Irish Brigade were mainly issued those rifles. You're going to notice that gun is built on a French style. Now, the reason behind that is because you can tell how a country is preparing for war by their military. Now, the powder blue, it's a lighter blue. Still cheap to make. Throw a little white ink in there, make it lighter. Still cheap to make. But you know what really sucks? Wearing dark blue in Mexico in the summer. You know what really sucks for your rifle? The cap pouch shrinking because of heat in Mexico. Manifest Destiny was something that was American policy. So we knew it was inevitable that we were going to come to blows with Mexico. So you can say there was certain preparations being made for years for this conflict. Again, even with the hat, we took off the shakos. We moved over to these slouch cap styles of hats because they're lighter and they're more comfortable to wear and they aren't targets. It's easier. I'm so sorry. But this is exactly what you would expect. And the thing is, from this uniform, almost everything will stay into the Civil War except the tunic. We kept the powder blue pants and we just changed the tunic back to that dark blue. But again, we're in the North. We don't have to worry about it.
Contrast to the taller and somewhat less fashionable shako-style hats. Union troops, also known as Federals, were outfitted in dark blue tunics and kepi hats borrowed from the French design.
I appreciate that this is Gettysburg and they showed actually a bunch of houses, including the Cadore farm from Gettysburg. But so like I just said, you're going to notice. Now, this is 1863, so these uniforms are completely different. If you were to get a, let's say, I'm going to show you guys what a New York State Excelsior jacket looks like. Because remember, at the beginning of the war, these were not, these were not federalized completely yet. This was very much early enough that you still had the specific states making uniforms. So, for example, right here, let me pop that open. Right here we have what's called an Excelsior jacket. So this is what primarily New York State militia would wear. Now, if you notice, it's got a lot of the light blue piping, but even more specifically, if we were to zoom in on the buttons, which actually, perfect. Sorry, I just want to make sure we're doing this. I like to make sure I get all my facts. These were the buttons. So that's the state of New York seal. So this is what you would expect from each state. Each state would have their own form of uniform at the beginning of the war. Example, the Irish Brigade, the 69th New York, was not actually, they did not originally wear the blue tunics. They actually originally wore Fire Zouave uniforms. They were the 69th New York Fire Zouaves originally. And we're actually, I do know we're going to talk about Zouaves very soon. Zouaves are a French style of infantry. Because again, yes, we took a lot of influence from the Prussians. But as he said, even the kepis, that's a French style of hat, a kepi. And even minet balls, which we call mini balls. We did take a lot of inspiration from the French. Zouaves were French. Chasseurs were French. The 14th Brooklyn, which Brooklyn at the time was its own city, the 14th Brooklyn wore a French chasseur uniform with 14 buttons on their false vest, 14 buttons on the regular uniform, and between their two legs, they had 7 buttons on each leg, representing 14. They were called the Red Leg Devils. But also you had units like Dury Zouaves, or who I believe we're going to see next, because I did actually look into this one, the New York Fire Zouaves, which were made up of primarily New York firemen.
While this was the standard uniform for the Union, some regiments opted for entirely different uniforms. When the Confederate States seceded from the Union, the CS Army opted for a more gray and earthy tone. The Confederate soldier, for a good part.
And this is what I love about Griffin, because he actually pays attention to these details. Because, you know, you go to places like Gettysburg. Give me a second. There we go. You go to a place like Gettysburg and they have found belt buckles or things like that. And you'll see these belt buckles that say CS or CSA or things like that. Which, sure, some of them probably exist. They probably did have them. But what was a much more common thing in the Confederate Army, if you look closely at the belt buckles here, they're U.S. Army belt buckles, but flipped upside down. That was actually something the Confederates did more, because what they did was they would, after battles, take from the dead. And a lot of the guys were dead Federal soldiers, so you would take U.S. belt buckles and they would just flip them upside down. But with that said, yes, Confederates were gray, but they were also brown. They were butternut. They were beige. They were tan. The Confederates were a volunteer army. There was no standard Confederate uniform. Like, yes, there were some units that had formalized uniforms, but that was also because they were sponsored units, either by states or by, honestly, plantation owners. A lot of plantation owners would raise regiments because that was their part in helping the war. But what's very interesting here is that he shows them in the gray shell jacket. Now, shell jacket, so you have a sack coat, which is the long blue, that's a long jacket, usually goes up to your upper thighs that you put everything over. We refer to those as a tunic usually, or a blouse. Shell jackets, that's what these guys are wearing. They're a little shorter. They're a little tighter, like a shell. So these are very good, and I actually really like that he's doing the Confederates as well.
From the Union, the CS Army opted for a more gray and earthy tone. The Confederate soldier, for a good part of the early war period, had to make do with older, less effective muskets. Zouaves were a class of light infantry regiments that were linked primarily with the...
So this unit is what we know as the New York Fire Zouaves. And where they are right now, as it says in the bottom, is the New York City draft riots. I find it interesting that these are the Zouaves he chose to show instead of like Dury Zouaves. I'll show you Dury Zouaves real quick. Because completely, when you think of Zouave, I don't think you really think of these guys. You probably think more... Yeah, these are probably a better one. You're thinking more these guys. You're thinking of the red pants. So I think it's interesting that he picked the Fire Zouaves, which is so funny because actually one of Lincoln's biggest issues during the draft riots was he really didn't want New York regiments going to put down the riots because, one, he didn't need a civil war within inside a civil war, but also he was sincerely afraid that New York regiments, especially the Fire Zouaves, would side with the rioters. The New York City Fire Zouaves were actually firemen. That's why they were called Fire Zouaves. I believe it's the 11th New York, 111th New York. They were firemen, and that's what the unit is, and actually their flag was a fire emblem. So I think it's very interesting that these are the ones that Griffin chose, but I digress.
The French army units serving in North Africa during the time. In the U.S., it was a man by the name of Elmer E. Ellsworth who, before the war, ran a drill company called the Zouave Cadets, who practiced in the manner of their French namesakes. Such units were raised on both sides of the war, such as the Union's 11th New York Infantry, the New York Fire Zouaves.
I was right the first time. I knew I was right. Also, Ellsworth, interesting character. Ellsworth will be killed early in the war. He was actually, I think, considered the... Actually, is that Ellsworth or Farnsworth? I believe that's Ellsworth. Yeah, Elmer Ellsworth. Elmer Ellsworth was actually a friend to Abraham Lincoln, a personal friend, and he was killed in the early days of the war, sadly. He was killed taking a Confederate flag down from across the Potomac. The store owner shot him, and he was the first Federal casualty killed by a Confederate in the war. And then the other man, the man who shot him, was technically the first Confederate casualty because Ellsworth's men shot the man in response. So very sad, but again, interesting that he... I knew it was the 11th.
As the United States began its expansionist phase, the Army continued to modernize and adapt to the changing battlefield. While previously introduced for far out western territories, the Montana peaked design hat was adopted by the Army as a service cover. The Army at this time also developed a tropical lightweight uniform for its campaigns in East Asia. When the United States...
Alright, let's hop back to that real quick. So, yeah, that's a better one. So again, this is what I mean about the idea of, you know what you're going to be doing, so you're kind of prepping your military for that. You know, I was born in the late 90s, so when I was growing up, our tanks weren't OD green. They were tan. As I've mentioned, I grew up around 9/11, and even then I remember the tanks in New York were tan. And in my head, I was like, why are they tan? And, you know, you could say it's because of Iraqi freed. It was because of, the Gulf War and stuff, which is fair. But at the same time, like right here's a perfect example, 1873 model musket, the lightweight uniforms, the slouch caps. You're preparing your army for the climate they're going to fight in. And the thing was, this uniform, that actually is just an undershirt. There was a tunic, but we didn't really force our men to wear it. It was a dark blue tunic as well. It was a navy blue tunic. But we just didn't make our men wear it because it kind of just seemed pointless to a level because it was so hot in places like Cuba and Guam. And honestly, China. Yeah, we fought in the Boxer Rebellion, and most of our men wore those uniforms. You know, if you want to see a great movie that shows it, there's a movie called 55 Days at Peking. It's about the days of the Boxer Rebellion. Charlton Heston's in it. He plays the major of the Americans defending the foreign litigation. This is literally exactly what they're wearing. The entire army was streamlined. The army, the cavalry, the Rough Riders wore very similar uniforms as well. They also wore tan trousers, though, because they were meant to be cavalry, but you really can't use cavalry in a jungle. So they were made into dismounted cavalry when they fought in Cuba. And that's my shout out to my boy, Theodore Roosevelt.
Western territories, the Montana peaked design hat was adopted by the Army as a service cover. The Army at this time also developed a tropical lightweight uniform for its campaigns in East Asia. When the United States entered the Great War, they had adapted much of the appearance of their British counterparts.
And that's for a specific reason. Our uniforms, like, we quickly turned over to the tan style of uniform. That's what we're seeing here. The reason we had to adopt the Tommy helmet was because we didn't really have a helmet at that time. We were actually still wearing slouch caps, or what I think most of us refer to as the park ranger hats. That was mainly what our armed forces were wearing. That's what people like John Pershing, who, and you know, this is a fact, in the early 1900s, we did invade Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa, the famous outlaw. So this is what our uniforms look like, minus the helmet, regardless. Because again, like I said, in the early 1900s, we were trying to phase out the blues and everything because we were realizing, you know, blue makes you an easy target. So maybe let's start moving into this like tan olive drab style of uniform. And the reason we wore the Tommy helmets, that's what the British helmet's called, is because the British had mass produced them. It was actually based a little bit off the Adrien helmet, the French style of helmet. The only difference is it didn't have the mohawk on it. I actually have one right there. But it was considered one of the safer helmets. It was actually the German helmet, the Stahlhelm, which was the safest, they said. But after that, it was pretty much the Stahlhelm, the Adrian, and then the Tommy helmet. Because again, the whole point of the Tommy helmet is it protects your ears and everything from rubble from coming above you. I also like that it shows him using a Tommy gun because Germany, after the war, the Geneva Convention, said they were inhumane. Because what we were pretty much doing was we were taking shotguns and blowing giant chunks into the trenches. And you'd have like 30 guys in a trench, and America would jump in with a Tommy gun, let one shell loose, and you're taking out like half the guys. So Germany found that very, one, dishonorable, and two, horrific.
The steel Brodie helmet, often nicknamed a doughboy helmet, and khaki or olive drab battle dress. The American Expeditionary Force fought its way to victory on the Western Front.
Also, the other thing is we weren't using just Tommy shotguns or trench guns. I don't know why the only gun they were holding were trench guns. We were using Springfield bolt-action rifles. This is actually coming towards the end of the Springfields. You know, the Springfield was the primary rifle of the United States almost from 1812 until World War I. And we did use Springfields into World War II. And Springfield Armory actually did start manufacturing M1 Garands as well. But this is where we're going to start seeing the phasing out of that style of rifle, sadly. And we should be going into World War II now.
The United States saw its ground forces make their debut in Operation Torch, fighting alongside the British in North Africa against the ferocious German Afrika Korps, ultimately driving the Nazis back to the Italian mainland. Taking note of the effectiveness of the German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, the U.S. developed their own airborne troops, who contributed greatly to victory in Europe. From the night landings prior to D-Day to the invasion of Germany, American airborne infantry were crucial to the Allies' victory. Rangers were elite light infantry forces organized in company-size formations. Rangers famously scaled Pointe du Hoc on D-Day to eliminate artillery.
I love Griffin, but sometimes his pronunciations are interesting. Pointe du Hoc. I think he was trying to do the French style. I'm just going to do the American style to make it a little easier. But yeah, so we just saw three different units, mainly that fought in Europe. We had the regular infantrymen, we had the airborne units, and now we have the Rangers. Obviously, airborne, Rangers, and infantry all still exist today. The Rangers were actually experimental. They were created strictly for Operation Overlord. Now, there are Ranger units in history, but like this specific unit of Ranger would become the modern day Ranger unit. The Rangers usually carried they were light infantry. They would carry carbines, Tommy guns, Thompsons if you would, BARs, obviously you had M1 spread out, and bazookas, M1 bazookas. And you would have the airborne would carry very similar weapons. The infantry is where you're going to see a lot more of just M1 Garands. You'll see guys with Springfield, sniper rifles and things like that.
Pieces which the Germans had evacuated just prior, but they also won fame in Italy at the Anzio beachhead prior to Operation Shingle. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, airborne units had fought through most of German-occupied Europe and now held their own during the Siege of Bastogne. From December 1944 to January of 1945, the battle-hardened Screaming Eagles of the 101st defended the city against determined German attacks. United States Marines under the U.S. Navy formed the...
Now, what's really funny about this is they were actually treated the worst. They, at the beginning of the war, didn't have any new things. They were using Springfield rifles, they were using the Doughboy Tommy helmets, and they were using Maxim machine guns. Like here they have them using a regular machine gun, but they actually, the Marines at the beginning of the war, they were not given anything good, and they still were able to win out at the end. The Marines would be primarily used in the Pacific, And World War II is where you see the U.S. Marines no longer be a part of the Department of the Navy. They would become their own branch of the armed forces.
Bulk of the ground forces in the Pacific Theater. They carried out the lightning-fast island-hopping campaign across Imperial Japanese territory, with Marines planting the Stars and Stripes on Mount Suribachi during the capture of Iwo Jima, becoming an iconic image of the Second World War. The Army Air Forces was responsible for most of the aerial combat during the war. Widely recognized, they would be split from the Army to become the United States Air Force. Following the end of the Second World War, the United States infantrymen remained relatively unchanged in gear and appearance.
So the reason I skipped that is just because the airborne really just wore the fatigues of all the other branches. It started as an element of the Army. Some airborne started as an element of the Navy, so they wore very similar uniforms. Korea, you're going to see almost the exact same uniforms as World War II. Korea happens in 52, World War II ends in 45. So there's really only a 7-year difference between the two wars. I'm going to be speeding this up because this is going very long. And again, I know it's only a 10-minute video, but I'm stopping and explaining these things because that's sadly how a reaction video is.
Though now they were a battle-hardened force experienced on all sides of the globe. By this time, the U.S. military as a whole had been desegregated by Executive Order 9981 of President Truman. During the Vietnam War, U.S. ground forces fought not only the North Vietnamese and their guerrilla warfare tactics, they fought against the tropical conditions. Uniforms would wear and tear until they disintegrated off of a soldier's body. A torn-up uniform came to be a mark of experience and veterancy. When the war ended, many found themselves struggling to readjust to civilian life once they returned home. Vietnam veterans remain the largest population of military vets to this day. In 1990...
So, that's very true. The Vietnam vets were treated terribly, and they probably saw some of the most horrific warfare. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they were fighting. And, you know, it wasn't... imagine the Eastern Theater of World War II times 1,000. The traps, the tunnel systems, the false tunnels, the grenade holes that they would throw a grenade into a trench and then it would roll out and come out the other side. It was horrific to be a serviceman, and sadly a lot of good men did die, especially being drafted and so on. So Vietnam is definitely an era that the American people should not forget, and we should hold our Vietnam veterans with a lot of dignity, because they fought a very hard fight, which they personally didn't want to fight, but they did it because, you know, they were doing what they thought was the right thing. And that's something I think a lot of people need to recognize about Vietnam and about our armed servicemen. You can't blame them for the actions of the brass and the higher ups. You know, the generals of today and even of the 1980s and 70s were not the generals of like the 1800s or even the early 1900s. It's a lot more politicking than there was back then, because again, you didn't really need as many generals. Now we have a general for everything, sadly.
The Iraqi army marched into Kuwait. This was met with both economic sanctions by United Nations members and the largest coalition of allied nations since the Second World War. Live news broadcasts displayed U.S. forces clad in camouflage uniforms attuned to the desert environment during Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm in the following year. When Kosovo declared independence in 1999, Serbian forces were sent in to
So what we're getting into here now, and I'm just going to fast forward because now these are going to pretty much be modern Army uniforms, and I'll stop here because this is our most recent uniform. Well, there we go. Oh, and they have the peaches and... Okay. So this is what our most modern Army uniform looks like. Well, one of them. This is U.S. Infantrymen at Fort Benning. We have changed our uniforms. Standard operational rifle is an M4A1 rifle. Automatic, semi-automatic rifle, which is automatic too. But And we still use Browning heavy machine guns to this day. But if you notice, it's going to be a lot more depending on the environment. You know, if we're fighting in the snow, we're going to have white camo. If we're fighting in the desert, we're going to have sand camo. If we're fighting in the forest, even here, this is an American woodland color scheme. This was actually something we really kind of took from Europe after World War II. We were noticing how a lot of their armed forces, the British paratroopers and such, they were getting camouflage that looked similar to where they were in Europe. So that's an interesting little factoid.
Primarily train at Fort Benning, Georgia, dubbed the home of the infantry. As of 2019, the U.S. Army introduced a new service uniform that harked back to the days of the Second World War and Korea, a modern iteration of the pinks and greens. The uniform that the greatest generation made famous during the 1940s and...
And again, you know, let's remove politics or, you know, who was the one that brought them back. They're a sharp uniform. They are a sharp-looking uniform. You know, this is my opinion.
Famous during the 1940s and 1950s. In Arlington National Cemetery, soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, dubbed the Old Guard, stand sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier. These sentinels remain at...
So this uniform that the sentinels wear, they still wear, but this is actually what our dress uniforms look like after World War, the Koreas and everything. We went back to blue for a period. And, you know, it's a sharp uniform as well. It's just some people liked the pinks and greens more. But with that said, what do you think? Did you enjoy what do you think is our best era of uniform? Mention in the comments. I love doing this. Again, this video went far longer than I was expecting. I don't want to cut them up again like I did to the Civil War video I just did on the Irish Civil War. So thank you so much for joining me. Please like, share, and comment if you enjoyed the content. Hit that red subscribe button. Hit the bell. Be notified whenever we're on. Also, please donate to our Patreon. Like I said, we have those 5 ranks. You can be a private. You can be a sergeant. You can be a captain, colonel, or join the Imperial staff and become a marshal. Thank you so much for joining us. And please try to donate to our national parks. They are struggling. Down below, we will have the link to History of Tim's National Parks Preservation Fund. Thank you so much, and we will see you in the next one.